Story number 1. Whispers from the Canopy. Winter in Tennessee had a way of cloaking the landscape in a deceptive tranquility. A blanket of snow that silenced the chirping of crickets and softened the harsh lines of the towering pines. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and what I'm about to recount is a story that has lingered in the corners of my mind like a persistent shadow ever since that fateful December night in 2018. A tale of curiosity, fear, and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. It all began when I inherited an old family property from my late uncle, a man whose eccentricities were as legendary in our family as his mysterious disappearance 20 years prior. The property was nestled deep within the Tennessee woods, a sprawling estate overshadowed by an ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over the land. Beneath its gnarled branches stood what locals referred to as the Treehouse, a whimsical structure built high among the limbs, its purpose as enigmatic as the man who constructed it. Uncle Henry had always been fascinated by the supernatural, often speaking of portals and intersections between realms that existed just beyond the perception of ordinary folk. The Treehouse, he believed, was a gateway, a place where the living and the dead could communicate, where the fabric of reality was thin enough to allow whispers from another world to seep through. Intrigued by his beliefs and driven by a need to reconnect with my family's past, I decided to restore the property and explore the secrets it held. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of cleaning and organizing. But as the nights grew longer and the nights colder, strange occurrences began to unfold, subtle at first, then increasingly unnerving. It started with the cold. No matter how many layers I wore or how thick the blankets were, an inexplicable chill permeated the treehouse, seeping into my bones and making my skin crawl. At night, the temperature would drop so drastically that my breath became visible, lingering in the air like ghostly apparitions. Then there were the footsteps. Late one evening, as I sat reading by the fireplace, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards above me. My heart raced as I glanced up, expecting to see one of the raccoons that often prowled the property. But the staircase remained empty, the shadows undisturbed by any presence. I tried to brush it off as the settling of the house, but deep down, I knew something was amiss. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to spend a night in the treehouse, documenting any unusual activity. Armed with a flashlight, my camera, and a notebook, I ascended the rickety ladder, the wood creaking ominously under my weight. The interior was surprisingly cozy, adorned with remnants of Uncle Henry's whimsical decor, colorful cushions, old books, and strange artifacts that hinted at his obsession with the supernatural. As midnight approached, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending snowflakes swirling in a frenzied dance. I settled into a corner, the fireplace providing a flickering light that cast long, eerie shadows across the room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a wolf. Just as I began to feel the weight of exhaustion, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the storm's fury. Sarah. The name was soft, carried on a breath of icy air. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of another presence. There was nothing, just the shadows dancing on the walls. Determined to stay rational, I picked up my notebook, jotting down the occurrence and deciding to investigate further. As I did, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a haunting melody that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the treehouse. Remember us, honor our stories. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping to unbearable levels. My fingers trembled as I tried to steady my flashlight, the beam flickering wildly. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the power flickered out, leaving me in pitch blackness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its flashlight to navigate the room. But before I could react, the whispers transformed into anguished cries, echoing through the treehouse like the tormented souls of the past. I felt a presence, an overwhelming sense of being watched, of countless eyes piercing through the darkness, judging and sorrowful. The walls seemed to close in, the very air thick with sorrow and longing. In a desperate attempt to calm myself, I called out, my voice barely a whisper, "Uncle Henry? Are you here?" The response was immediate, a chorus of whispers, a symphony of lost souls crying out for recognition and remembrance. Shadows began to take shape, forming ethereal figures that floated gracefully among the tree branches visible through the windows. One figure, more distinct than the others, approached me. It was Uncle Henry, his form shimmering like a mirage, his eyes filled with a sorrow that transcended time. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a haunting echo, "you must remember us. You must honor our stories." Tears welled in my eyes as I reached out, my hand passing through his ghostly form. "I'm so sorry I left. I didn't know. I want to help." The apparition nodded, his presence growing more intense. "You have the power to bridge the worlds. Help us find peace, and the veil between our realms will strengthen, protecting you and our stories from being forgotten." As the first light of dawn pierced through the snow-covered trees, the spirits began to fade, their whispers softening into a gentle breeze. The temperature rose gradually, the oppressive chill lifting as the treehouse returned to its peaceful state. Exhausted but resolute, I descended the ladder, the events of the night etched into my memory like a permanent scar. In the weeks that followed, I dedicated myself to preserving the treehouse, ensuring that the stories of those who had come before were not lost to the shadows. I documented my experiences, creating a journal that detailed the hauntings and the messages from Uncle Henry and the restless spirits. My recordings captured the faint whispers and the ghostly apparitions, providing tangible evidence of the supernatural presence that inhabited the treehouse. Word of my experiences spread, drawing curious visitors and skeptics alike to the once-abandoned property. Some came seeking thrills, while others hoped to uncover their own connections to the spirits of Elkhorn. But as winter returned each year, the whispers of the past grew louder, their voices intertwining with the wind and snow, a haunting reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the realms beyond. One particularly cold night, as I sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the journey that had changed my life, I heard the familiar whispers once more. "Honor our stories. Remember us." The voices were softer now, filled with gratitude and peace. I knew then that my efforts had not been in vain, that the spirits of Elkhorn had found the closure they had long sought, their stories forever preserved in the heart of the treehouse. As I gaze out the window at the snow-covered landscape, I feel a profound connection to the past, a bond that transcends time and space. The whispers of Elkhorn continue to echo through the winter nights, a haunting melody that serves as a testament to the enduring power of memory and the unbreakable bonds between the living and the dead. And as long as the snow falls and the wind whispers through the pines, the stories of Elkhorn's lost souls will remain alive, forever etched into the fabric of the treehouse and the hearts of those who remember. Story number 2. Mystery at the Vermont Treehouse. Winter in Vermont was both beautiful and unforgiving. The snow transformed the landscape into a pristine white canvas, blanketing the dense forests and quaint towns in a serene silence. My name is Alex Parker, and this is the story of a night that forever changed my perception of reality and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. It was early December when my friends and I decided to embark on a weekend camping trip deep into the heart of Vermont's wilderness. We were a group of 6 college friends looking to escape the stresses of our academic lives and immerse ourselves in nature. Among us were Emily, the fearless leader with an adventurous spirit; Jason, the pragmatic one who always carried a first aid kit; Lisa, the skeptic who dismissed most supernatural tales; Mike, the storyteller who loved nothing more than a good ghost story; Sarah, the quiet observer; and me, Alex, the writer eager to capture our experiences in words. Our destination was an old treehouse rumored to be abandoned for decades, perched high in the branches of a towering oak near the edge of Lake Shadowmere. The locals had spun numerous tales about the place, stories of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and an eerie feeling of being watched. Naturally, these stories only fueled our excitement and curiosity. We arrived on a chilly Friday afternoon, the sky overcast with heavy clouds that threatened snow. The forest was quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife subdued by the impending winter storm. As we trekked through the thick underbrush, the trees seemed to close in around us, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Finally, we reached the treehouse, its wooden structure weathered and worn, nestled securely among the sturdy limbs of the oak. Setting up our campsite was a breeze, the treehouse proving to be a sturdy shelter despite its age. Inside, the space was cramped but surprisingly intact. Old furniture lay scattered about, covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs adorned every corner. The view from the windows was breathtaking. Lake Shadowmere stretched out below, its surface smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the gray sky above. As night fell, we gathered around a small fire outside the treehouse, sharing stories and laughing under the starlit sky. The temperature dropped rapidly, the wind picking up and causing the flames to flicker wildly. It wasn't long before the forest was enveloped in darkness, the only light coming from our fire and the occasional flash of lightning in the distance. After a few hours, Emily suggested we explore the surrounding area. Armed with flashlights, we ventured out into the night, the snow crunching under our boots. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds absent. As we made our way around the lake, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, followed by a low, mournful howl. Our group froze, exchanging nervous glances. "Probably just a wolf," Jason suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. We continued our exploration, but the sense of being watched lingered, making every rustle and snap of a twig seem ominous. Returning to the treehouse, we found Mike staring intently at the wall, his flashlight beam fixed on a peculiar mark. "Look at this," he whispered, pointing to a handprint smeared on the wooden paneling. It was dark and smudged, almost as if someone had pressed their hand against the wall and then recoiled in fear. My heart raced as I examined the mark more closely. There was something unnerving about its shape, something that didn't quite belong. Lisa scoffed, trying to brush off the discovery. "Probably just some paint or a stain. No need to freak out," she said, though her eyes betrayed her unease. Emily, ever the brave one, suggested we leave it and go to bed, but Mike was insistent on figuring out what had caused the mark. We decided to stay up and investigate further, setting up a makeshift command center in the treehouse. Jason grabbed his first aid kit, while Sarah and I documented the environment, noting every detail that seemed out of place. As the night wore on, the storm intensified, the wind howling outside and the trees groaning under the weight of the snow. Around midnight, the temperature inside the treehouse plummeted, our breaths visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. Though no one was moving, the lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to dance on their own accord. Emily clutched her blanket tightly, eyes wide with fear, while Mike tried to rationalize the phenomena. "That's just the house settling," he said, though his voice shook slightly. But before he could finish, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, followed by the sound of glass shattering. We all jumped, the scream sending a wave of panic through the group. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We rushed outside to find Emily missing. The snow around the treehouse was undisturbed, no footprints leading away from the shelter. Desperate calls echoed through the silent forest, but there was no response. We searched for hours, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but Emily was nowhere to be found. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a pristine layer of snow in its wake. We returned to the treehouse. Exhaustion and fear etched into our faces. The only sign of Emily was the strange handprint on the wall, now more prominent in the morning light. We contacted the local authorities, but despite extensive searches, no trace of Emily was ever found. The handprint remained, a chilling reminder of that fateful night. Months passed, and the mystery of Emily's disappearance lingered, haunting our thoughts and dreams. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that treehouse. Determined to find answers, I delved into the history of Lake Shadowmere and the surrounding area. What I discovered was a tale of tragedy and loss, a story of a young girl who had vanished in the same spot decades earlier, leaving behind only a similar handprint on the treehouse wall. One winter night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I returned to the treehouse alone. The snow had once again begun to fall, covering the landscape in a soft, white blanket. As I approached, the familiar sight of the treehouse brought a sense of déjà vu, the air thick with the memory of that night. I entered, the door creaking open as if welcoming me back. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, the handprint on the wall, the remnants of our frantic search, and an overwhelming sense of sorrow that filled the room. I set up my camera and began recording, hoping to capture any sign of the supernatural. Hours passed in tense silence, the only sounds being the occasional gust of wind and the crackling of the old fireplace. Just as I was about to give up, the temperature dropped sharply, and the room grew icy cold. My breath formed visible clouds in the air as I felt a presence, an unseen force that seemed to watch my every move. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room, followed by the faint sound of children's laughter. My heart pounded as I turned to see the ghostly figure of Emily standing before me, her eyes filled with sorrow and fear. "Why did you leave us?" she whispered, her voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the treehouse. Tears welled in my eyes as I stepped forward, reaching out to her. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I never meant to leave you. I just wanted to help." Emily's form flickered, her ghostly presence wavering like a candle in the wind. "Remember us," she whispered, the words hanging heavy in the air. "Honor our stories, and we will find peace." Before I could respond, the room began to shake, the walls groaning under an invisible weight. The handprint on the wall glowed with an otherworldly light, casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. The temperature plummeted further, and the whispers of the past swirled around me, their voices intertwining with the storm's fury outside. Desperate to help the restless spirits, I began to recount their stories, sharing the history I had uncovered and the pain they had endured. As I spoke, the handprint's glow intensified, and the ghostly figures of the lost souls began to fade, their sorrowful expressions softening into peaceful smiles. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a serene calm that filled the treehouse. When dawn broke, the snow-covered landscape was bathed in a gentle light, the treehouse standing silent and still. I packed up my equipment, the weight of the night's events settling into my bones. As I left, I felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that the spirits had found the peace they had long sought. Back in the safety of my home, I penned down the events of that night. The mystery of the Vermont treehouse finally unraveled. The disappearance of Emily remained a chilling reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown, and the enduring power of memory to bridge that gap. Years later, the treehouse remains a silent sentinel in the Vermont wilderness, its secrets laid to rest beneath the snow. But on cold winter nights, some say you can still hear the faint echoes of children's laughter and the whispers of lost souls, forever reminding us of the mysteries that lie just beyond the reach of our understanding. Story number 3. Echoes in the Canopy. Winter in the Appalachian Mountains had a way of cloaking the landscape in an ethereal silence, where the snow muffled even the most persistent sounds of nature. My name is Mark Sullivan, and my fascination with abandoned places and their hidden stories led me to the heart of this quiet wilderness. Nestled among towering pines and rugged terrain stood the remnants of an old treehouse, a forgotten relic that whispered tales of joy and tragedy from its wooden beams. The treehouse, once a sanctuary for families seeking respite and panoramic views, had fallen into disrepair decades ago. Its once vibrant paint was now chipped and faded, and the roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. Locals spoke of strange occurrences around the area, children's laughter echoing through the night, fleeting shadows darting between the trees, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. Intrigued by these stories, I decided to spend a weekend alone in the treehouse, hoping to uncover the truth behind the legends. I arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon, the sun beginning its descent behind the dense canopy. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of an impending storm. As I approached the treehouse, the sense of isolation was palpable, the only signs of life being the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. I unpacked my gear, setting up my camera and notebook, determined to document any unusual activity. The first night was uneventful. I sat in the cramped interior, gazing out through the broken windows at the snow-covered landscape. The silence was both comforting and unnerving, a stark contrast to the lively stories I had heard. As midnight approached, the temperature plummeted, and a chill settled into my bones. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to stave off the cold as I scribbled notes about my observations. Around 2 in the morning, the tranquility was shattered by the sound of faint laughter. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on my ears, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakably children's laughter, sweet and carefree, yet tinged with a melancholy that sent shivers down my spine. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to emanate from all directions, echoing through the hollow spaces of the treehouse. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured outside, the beam slicing through the darkness. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped onto the icy platform, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. The laughter had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me. I turned back to the treehouse, my mind racing with questions. Who could be out here at this hour, in such a remote location? As I re-entered the treehouse, a sudden gust of wind blew open the shutters, extinguishing the small lamp I had lit. The room plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the gaps. I fumbled for my camera, hoping to capture any anomaly, but the cold seemed to seep into my very soul, numbing my fingers and clouding my thoughts. Just as I was about to settle back into my blanket, I heard it, a soft thud from below, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart raced as I realized I was not alone. Gathering every ounce of courage, I held my breath, trying to remain as still as possible. The footsteps grew closer, then paused, as if the presence was merely observing. Then, without warning, a shadow flitted across the room, dancing just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. I lunged towards the window, my pulse hammering in my ears, but saw nothing, only the swirling snow and the oppressive darkness of the forest beyond. The laughter returned, now intermingled with whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the treehouse. Remember us, honor our stories. Terrified yet driven by an insatiable need to understand, I began to investigate the origins of the treehouse. Research revealed that it had been built in the early 1980s by the Thompson family, a father, mother, and their 2 children seeking a secluded retreat. The family had vanished one winter night without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings and the now abandoned treehouse. Despite extensive searches, no evidence of foul play or survival was ever found, leading to rampant speculation about supernatural involvement. Determined to honor the memory of the Thompson family and uncover the truth, I delved deeper into the history of the area. I discovered old newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances and strange phenomena reported by other visitors. Some believed the treehouse was a nexus between our world and another, a place where the veil was thin and the spirits of the lost could linger. the more I learned. The more the treehouse seemed to come alive around me. Each night brought new sounds, whispers, laughter, and the soft thudding of invisible footsteps. I documented everything, piecing together a narrative of sorrow and longing that permeated the very structure of the treehouse. The spirits were not malevolent but trapped, yearning for recognition and release from their eternal limbo. On the final night of my stay, I decided to perform a ritual of remembrance. Inspired by the stories of the Thompson family, I lit candles around the room, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. I spoke aloud, honoring the memories of those who had been lost and pleading for their spirits to find peace. The temperature dropped even further, and the air grew thick with an almost tangible presence. As I finished the ritual, a profound silence settled over the treehouse. The whispers ceased, replaced by a serene stillness that felt like a sigh of relief. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that I had done everything I could to honor the spirits that haunted this place. As dawn broke, the first light of day filtered through the trees, melting the remnants of the night's horrors and leaving behind a peaceful stillness. Driving away from the Appalachian wilderness, I glanced back at the treehouse one last time. The sun shone brightly on the snow-covered landscape, and the oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. The experiences I had endured at the treehouse had changed me, deepening my understanding of the unseen forces that connect us all. Years later, the story of the haunted treehouse in the Appalachian Mountains remains one of my most poignant and terrifying experiences. It serves as a reminder that some places hold memories too powerful to fade, their stories etched into the very fabric of the land. The whispers of the Thompson family continue to echo in my mind, a haunting melody that underscores the enduring power of remembrance and the thin veil that separates our world from the realms of the departed. And so, whenever winter descends upon the Appalachian wilderness, I find myself drawn back to the memories of that snowy night, honoring the spirits who once called the treehouse home, and ensuring that their stories remain alive in the silent whispers of the forest. Story number 4. The Faceless Man Treehouse. Winter in Oregon had a way of transforming the landscape into a monochromatic painting, where shadows stretched long and the silence was only broken by the whisper of the wind through the evergreens. My name is Daniel Harris, and my fascination with abandoned places had led me to one of the most enigmatic sites in the Pacific Northwest, a forgotten treehouse nestled deep within the dense forests of southern Oregon. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, referring to it as the dwelling of the Faceless Man, a spectral entity whose presence was felt but rarely seen. It was a cold December afternoon when I decided to embark on this solitary expedition. Armed with my camera, a sturdy backpack, and a flashlight, I drove along the winding gravel roads that led to the heart of the wilderness. The journey was arduous, the narrow path barely visible beneath the thick blanket of snow. As I navigated through the dense woods, the towering pines seemed to close in around me, their branches heavy with ice and snowflakes that glittered like tiny stars in the fading light. After hours of trekking, I finally reached the clearing where the treehouse stood. It was perched high among the branches of an ancient Douglas fir, its wooden planks weathered and worn by years of neglect. The structure was surprisingly intact, a testament to the craftsmanship of its unknown builder. I approached cautiously, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. The air was frigid, each breath a visible cloud that dissipated into the cold night air. I began my ascent, the ladder creaking ominously with each step. As I climbed, a sense of unease settled over me, a feeling that I was being watched by unseen eyes. Reaching the entrance, I pushed open the door, which groaned in protest, revealing the dimly lit interior. The treehouse was modest, with just enough space to accommodate a small bed, a table, and a few personal belongings long forgotten. The windows were cracked, allowing the moonlight to filter through and cast ghostly patterns on the floor. Setting up my equipment, I decided to explore the treehouse thoroughly. The first thing that caught my attention was a series of faded photographs hanging on the wall. Pictures of a man and his family, their faces obscured by time and decay. Among them was a single photograph of the man alone, his face entirely blank, leaving only the contours of his head and shoulders visible. It was this image that earned him the moniker the Faceless Man. As I examined the photographs, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Just as I was about to dismiss it as a draft, I heard it, a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the treehouse. The sound was indistinct, a chorus of hushed voices that sent shivers down my spine. I turned off my flashlight, relying solely on the eerie moonlight, and strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, yet still elusive. Remember us, honor our stories. The voices seemed to chant, their tones filled with sorrow and longing. My heart pounded as I felt an overwhelming presence, as if the spirits of the past were reaching out to me, urging me to uncover the truth behind their restless existence. Determined to understand, I began to document everything, jotting down notes and capturing photographs of the treehouse's interior. As the night wore on, the whispers intensified, swirling around me like a spectral breeze. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, fleeting glimpses of movement that vanished when I turned to look. The feeling of being watched became almost unbearable, the invisible eyes probing my very soul. Around midnight, the atmosphere in the treehouse shifted dramatically. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I felt a surge of fear, the realization that I was not alone in this abandoned sanctuary. Summoning my courage, I decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping to find any clues that could shed light on the mystery of the Faceless Man. Climbing down from the treehouse, I made my way through the snow-covered forest, the only sounds being the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of an owl in the distance. The moon was high, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape, illuminating the path ahead with an otherworldly light. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of being followed intensified, the invisible presence lingering just out of sight. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a clearing where the remnants of an old campsite lay buried beneath the snow. A dilapidated tent, its fabric torn and frayed, stood as a silent witness to past gatherings and forgotten stories. Near the tent, I found scattered belongings, empty bottles, a rusted flashlight, and a faded journal partially buried in the snow. My hands trembled as I picked up the journal, flipping through its pages filled with hurried notes and sketches of the Faceless Man. The entries detailed the experiences of a group of friends who had ventured into the same treehouse years ago, only to disappear without a trace. Their writings spoke of unexplained phenomena, whispers in the night, shadows moving against the wind, and the overwhelming sense of being watched by an unseen entity. The last entry was particularly chilling, describing a night much like the one I was experiencing, culminating in the disappearance of one of their own. As I read the final words, a cold wind swept through the clearing, extinguishing the light of my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of the situation. If the previous visitors had vanished, what would become of me? Desperate to find my way back, I began to retrace my steps, the whispers of the forest now replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Just as I thought I had lost my way, I felt a presence beside me, a sensation of being watched so intensely that it felt like needles piercing my skin. I turned slowly, my flashlight flickering back to life, revealing nothing but the snow-covered trees and the empty clearing. But the feeling of eyes upon me remained, an invisible force probing my every move. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of children's laughter, a haunting melody that echoed through the night air. The sound was both familiar and foreign, sending chills down my spine. I followed the laughter, hoping to find some sign of the missing friends. But the forest only grew denser, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels guarding ancient secrets. Hours passed as I wandered through the wilderness, the oppressive feeling of being watched never leaving me. Exhausted and on the verge of giving up, I stumbled upon a small, makeshift shrine tucked away in a secluded grove. Candles burned with a flickering flame, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding snow. At the center stood a wooden effigy of the faceless man, his featureless face staring blankly into the void. Tears welled in my eyes as I approached the shrine, the weight of the spirit's sorrow pressing down on me. I knelt before the effigy, offering a silent prayer for the lost souls who lingered in this forsaken place. As I did, the temperature began to rise, the oppressive chill lifting and replaced by a sense of peace that washed over me like a warm embrace. The whispers returned, softer this time, filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you. Remember us." The voices were no longer filled with sorrow but with a serene acceptance, their restless spirits finally finding the closure they had long sought. I felt a profound connection to their stories, a responsibility to honor their memories and share their experiences with the world. As dawn broke over the horizon, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, melting the remnants of the night's horrors and illuminating the path back to the treehouse. I made my way home, the memory of that night etched into my soul, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the thin veil that separates our world from the realms of the departed. Back in the safety of my home, I pored over my notes and photographs, compiling the story of our harrowing experience and the mystery of the faceless man. The journey had not only uncovered the truth behind the disappearances, but had also forged a deeper understanding of the connection between the living and the dead. The treehouse, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a symbol of remembrance and the enduring bonds that transcend life and death. Years later, the story of the faceless man treehouse remains a chilling tale that continues to captivate and terrify those who hear it. Visitors who dare to explore the site report similar experiences, feeling watched by invisible eyes, hearing whispers in the night, and witnessing fleeting shadows that dance among the trees. The legacy of the lost souls lives on, their stories forever intertwined with the silent embrace of the Vermont wilderness. And so, whenever winter descends upon the Appalachian forests, I am reminded of that fateful night and the spirits who once roamed the treehouse, their whispers echoing through the cold air, ensuring that their memories remain alive in the hearts of those who remember. Story number 5. The Weeping Treehouse. Washington's forests are as much a place of beauty as they are of mystery. The dense canopies and perpetual rain create an atmosphere where sunlight feels like an intrusion. My name is Eric Malone, and I'm no stranger to exploring the unexplained. Over the years, I've walked through ghost towns, abandoned mines, and forgotten asylums, but nothing could have prepared me for the eerie story of the Weeping Treehouse. Locals warned me against going. The treehouse, they said, was no ordinary relic of the past. Built high in an ancient cedar deep within the woods, it had been abandoned for decades. On stormy nights, people claimed they could hear sobbing coming from its empty interior, a sound that would carry on the wind like a haunting melody. Some had seen strange lights glowing in its windows, as if the house were alive and watching. The day I ventured out was typical for Washington. Gray skies and a drizzle that seeped into your bones. The trail leading to the treehouse was overgrown, the forest so thick that every step felt like trespassing into another world. The air grew colder the farther I went, the silence broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow. After an hour of hiking, I saw it. The treehouse was perched about 30 feet above the forest floor, a crooked structure built into the twisted limbs of a massive cedar. Its planks were dark with age and rain, and the windows were streaked with grime, but it still held a strange kind of majesty. A crude wooden ladder led up to the entrance, swaying slightly in the breeze. The first thing I noticed as I approached was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the vague unease you get when you're alone in the woods. It was sharp, focused, like a pair of invisible eyes tracking my every move. I hesitated at the base of the ladder, the stories I'd heard flashing through my mind. But curiosity won out, and I began to climb. The ladder creaked with every step, each sound amplified by the oppressive silence around me. Reaching the top, I pushed open the warped wooden door and stepped inside. The air was damp and carried the faint scent of mildew. The room was small and bare, its walls lined with dusty shelves and old wooden beams. A single chair sat in the corner, the seat broken and splintered. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, the first sob broke the silence. It was faint, like a child crying in another room. My heart pounded as I turned toward the sound. But there was no one there. The sobbing continued, growing louder and more desperate, as if the source was moving closer. I swung the flashlight around, the beam trembling in my hand. The light landed on something strange. A faint glow emanating from the far corner of the treehouse pulsed softly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. My breath caught as I moved closer, the crying now so loud that it felt as though it were inside my head. The glow seemed to come from the floorboards, seeping through the cracks like liquid light. The air grew colder as I crouched to inspect the source of the glow. Just as I reached out to touch the floor, the sobbing stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Before I could move, the entire treehouse shook, a low rumble reverberating through its beams. The glow beneath the floorboards intensified, and then I heard it, a voice. "Help me." The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried a desperation that sent chills down my spine. I scrambled back, my flashlight flickering as the treehouse seemed to come alive around me. The walls groaned, and the shelves rattled, as if the structure itself was reacting to the voice. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The sobbing returned, louder and more anguished, filling the room with its mournful cry. The glow from the floorboards spread, casting the entire space in an eerie, unnatural light. Shadows began to move along the walls, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The sobbing paused, replaced by a soft whisper. "They left me here. Don't leave me." The shadows coalesced into a single form, a pale, translucent figure of a young girl. Her face was blurred, her features indistinct, but her presence was undeniable. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her as though pleading for help. Her form flickered like a dying flame, her outline dissolving and reforming with each pulse of the glow beneath the floor. "What happened to you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "They took everything," she whispered. I waited, but no one came back. Before I could respond, the air in the treehouse changed again. The glow beneath the floor turned red, casting the room in a sinister light. The girl's form began to dissolve, her cries replaced by an ominous growl that seemed to come from all around me. The walls trembled, and the shadows on them grew darker and more defined, taking on shapes that were distinctly human. I felt a sharp, cold pressure on my shoulder, like a hand gripping me tightly. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive weight of the air and the sound of the growl growing louder. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. The sobbing returned, layered with the faint sound of laughter, a cruel and mocking tone that echoed in my ears. The door finally gave way, and I burst out into the cold night air. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against my face as I scrambled down the ladder. I didn't stop running until I was deep into the forest, the sounds of the treehouse fading into the distance. Even then, the feeling of being watched never left me, as though the eyes of the forest were following me all the way back to my car. I drove away without looking back, my mind racing with what I had seen and heard. I spent weeks researching the history of the treehouse, but all I found were vague mentions of a family who had disappeared decades ago, leaving no trace behind. The stories of sobbing and strange lights had been circulating for years, but no one had ever dared to investigate them further. Even now, the memory of that night lingers. I can still hear the girl's voice in my mind, her desperate plea echoing in the silence. I don't know what happened in that treehouse or why it remains a focal point for such anguish. But I do know this. It's not just a relic of the past. It's alive, and it's waiting. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the trees, you might hear it too, the sound of a child crying, calling out from the shadows of the weeping treehouse. Story number 6. The Night Stalker's Treehouse. Texas holds its secrets in the dense, sweltering heat of its summers and the thick shadows of its forests. Deep in East Texas lies the treehouse of Raymond the Night Stalker Blake, a serial killer whose gruesome deeds haunted the 1980s. Though Blake was executed decades ago, the stories about his hideout persist. Locals whisper of pale figures appearing in the windows and disembodied voices that seem to echo through the surrounding trees. The forest was a tangle of overgrown paths and towering trees, the kind of place where sunlight barely touched the ground. I made my way deeper into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the oppressive shadows. The air was heavy with moisture despite the cool breeze, and every crunch of leaves underfoot felt like an intrusion into forbidden territory. The farther I walked, the quieter the forest became, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When the clearing came into view, the treehouse emerged like a forgotten specter, perched high in the branches of an ancient oak. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its wood darkened by time and decay. A makeshift ladder led to a weathered door that hung loosely on rusted hinges. The windows, cracked and grimy, seemed to watch me as I approached, daring me to come closer. Climbing the ladder, I felt the temperature drop sharply, each rung creaking under my weight. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a room shrouded in shadow. The air was damp, carrying the faint, metallic tang of rust and decay. My flashlight illuminated the space, a crude table, a chair tipped on its side, and walls covered in carvings. Names, dates, and strange symbols etched into the wood created a chaotic tapestry of the past. A flicker of movement caught my eye near one of the windows. I swung the flashlight around, my pulse quickening. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure standing just beyond the glass. But when I looked again, it was gone. My heart pounded as I stepped closer to the wall, studying the carvings more closely. Some of the symbols looked like crude attempts at sigils, while others resembled tally marks. My fingers traced a series of initials carved into the wood, the letters jagged and deep. The sound of faint whispers filled the air. They were soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but quickly grew louder. My flashlight flickered as the whispers seemed to move around the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. The words were indistinct, but their tone carried a weight of sorrow and desperation. I turned slowly, scanning the room for anything that could explain the phenomenon. But the shadows only deepened. Something cold brushed against my arm, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I caught my breath and aimed the beam toward the far corner, where the light revealed the faint outline of a figure. Its form was hazy and pale, as though it were made of smoke, and its face was an empty blur. The figure lingered for a moment before disappearing, leaving behind a chilling silence. The air around me grew heavy, pressing down on my chest as the whispers returned. This time, they were more coherent, a chorus of voices murmuring, "Help us, free us." My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but my curiosity kept me rooted in place. The room began to shift, the walls and floorboards trembling as if responding to an unseen force. My surroundings blurred, and suddenly, I wasn't in the dilapidated treehouse anymore. The space was alive, vibrant, and horrifying. Blood spattered the walls, and the air was thick with the echoes of screams. Shadows moved through the room, distorted figures locked in a silent struggle. I saw him then, Raymond Blake, his form towering and monstrous, his face obscured by shadow. He moved with calculated precision, his every motion exuding malice. The vision was overwhelming, a vivid glimpse into the horrors that had unfolded in this place. As quickly as it came, it vanished, leaving me gasping for breath on the floor of the decayed treehouse. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent. "Free us, please!" I could feel their pain, their longing for release from whatever bound them to this cursed place. I staggered toward the door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. As I reached the ladder, I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw him, Blake's shadowy figure looming in the corner, his eyeless face fixed on me. "You don't belong here," he growled, his voice low and guttural. My blood ran cold as his form seemed to stretch toward me, his darkness consuming the room. I scrambled down the ladder, nearly losing my grip as the whispers followed me into the night. The forest seemed alive, the shadows shifting and moving as if they were watching my every step. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the path back to my car felt infinitely longer than it had before. When I finally reached the clearing where I had parked, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I threw myself into the driver's seat and sped away. The image of Blake's shadow burned into my mind. I never returned to the treehouse, but its memory has haunted me ever since. I've spent countless hours researching Blake and his victims, trying to understand the darkness that lingers in that place. The pale figures, the whispers, the vision of his crimes, all of it points to a lingering evil that refuses to be forgotten. The treehouse isn't just haunted, it's a prison, a place where the spirits of the innocent remain trapped with the monster who took their lives. The locals still avoid the area, their stories growing more chilling with each retelling. Some believe the treehouse is cursed, a nexus of unspeakable pain and suffering. Others say the spirits are waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to release them. For me, the treehouse serves as a stark reminder of the thin line between curiosity and horror, and the price of crossing it. On quiet nights, when the wind carries a chill through the air, I sometimes think I can hear the faint whispers from that treehouse, calling out from the darkness. Their voices are a haunting melody, a plea for freedom that I can never forget. Story number 7. The Singing Oak Treehouse. Louisiana's bayous are a realm of shadows and secrets. The air hangs heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth, and the dense trees form an almost impenetrable canopy, casting everything below in perpetual twilight. My name is Rachel Devereaux, and I thought I understood the legends of this place. Growing up here, you hear stories, ghosts drifting through cemeteries, curses lingering in the swamps, but none haunted me more than the tale of the Singing Oak Treehouse. It was said to be built atop an ancient oak tree deep in the forest near Bayou Teche. The oak was massive, its twisted branches sprawling like the veins of some ancient beast. Locals whispered that the tree had been used for dark rituals long before the area was settled. Even now, strange symbols could be found etched into its trunk, glowing faintly under the full moon. And then there was the singing haunting, wordless melodies that echoed through the forest on moonlit nights. No one dared go near it, not since the last visitor disappeared decades ago. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. Equipped with a flashlight, camera, and a notebook, I set out on a humid October evening. The moon was nearly full, its silver light filtering through the trees as I followed an old hunting trail that wound deeper into the woods. The oak came into view just as the last traces of sunlight faded. It was even larger than I had imagined, its gnarled trunk wide enough to house a family. The treehouse perched atop it was barely visible through the dense foliage, its wooden frame blending seamlessly with the branches. The air grew colder as I approached, a sharp contrast to the muggy heat of the bayou. My skin prickled with a sense of foreboding. The first thing I noticed was the symbols. They covered the tree's bark, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight. My flashlight beam traced their lines, and I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the tree itself were calling to me. I reached out to touch one of the carvings, but a sudden sound stopped me, a low, mournful hum, like the beginning of a song. The singing grew louder as I climbed the ladder to the treehouse, each step creaking under my weight. It was a wordless melody, eerie and beautiful, resonating in a way that felt almost physical. By the time I reached the top, my heart was pounding, though I couldn't tell if it was from exertion or fear. Inside, the treehouse was surprisingly intact, its walls lined with shelves filled with objects that seemed out of place. Melted candles, rusted knives, and jars filled with dark, unidentifiable substances. The floorboards were carved with the same strange symbols that adorned the tree, their lines glowing faintly in the moonlight that streamed through a broken window. As I moved through the space, the singing seemed to surround me, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The symbols on the floor grew brighter, their glow pulsating in time with the melody. I crouched to examine them, my fingers hovering over the carvings. And that's when I saw it, a faint shimmer, like heat rising off pavement, taking shape in the air above the symbols. The figure was barely visible at first, a distortion in the air that grew clearer with each pulse of the light. It was a woman, her form translucent and ethereal, her face obscured by a veil of shadows. She moved with a grace that seemed unnatural, her arms outstretched as if beckoning me closer. Her voice joined the song, weaving a mournful harmony that made my chest ache. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling, her head tilted, and for a moment, I thought she might answer, but instead, the singing stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The glow of the symbols flared, and the woman dissolved into the air, leaving me alone in the dim light. Before I could process what had happened, the treehouse began to shake. The shelves rattled, jars tumbling to the floor and shattering. The symbols on the walls and floor pulsed wildly, their glow almost blinding. A deep, guttural sound echoed from below, like the groan of the tree itself, and I realized I wasn't alone. I turned toward the door, but the air in the room seemed to thicken, slowing my movements. Shadows coalesced around the edges of the room, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a breeze. The singing returned, but it was different now, angrier, more chaotic, a discordant wail that set my teeth on edge. The shadows surged toward me, and I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my wrist. I yanked free and stumbled toward the ladder, barely managing to grip the rungs as I scrambled downward. The singing grew louder, following me as I descended, the tree's groans blending with the cacophony until it felt like the whole forest was alive with sound. When my feet hit the ground, I didn't stop running. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The symbols on the oak's trunk glowed brightly, their light illuminating the path as if guiding me away. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I slammed the door and sped away. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, hear faint strains of that haunting melody in the dead of night. The symbols I'd seen in the treehouse began to appear in my dreams, their lines burning into my mind like brands. I tried to find answers, poring over local records and folklore. But the history of the Singing Oak was fragmented at best. Some claimed it had been a site of voodoo rituals. Others said it was a place of worship for an ancient, forgotten god. Whatever its origins, one thing was clear. The tree held a power that was neither natural nor benevolent. I haven't returned to the treehouse, and I don't plan to. The memory of that night is enough to keep me away. But sometimes, on moonlit nights when the air is still and the world feels just a little too quiet, I hear the song again, faint and distant, calling to me from the shadows. And I wonder if the woman I saw, and the shadows that followed, are still waiting for someone foolish enough to answer.